Hello, everybody. Good to be with you as usual. So today I want to address something that you don't hear very much about. I'm not even sure that I have ever heard a talk on this, but I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I actually heard somebody else talk. So what about the post-awakening blues? Have you ever heard of this? If you have had an awakening experience, my guess is that you're well acquainted with the post-awakening blues. And if you're not yet awake, then you can pretty much bet that you are going to be affected by the post-awakening blues, and you might as well listen to this anyway, because the odds are, if you're listening to this, that you're going to wake up at some point. You can only resist this teaching for so long. So that included this, which was my first client. So when Fred first woke up, now there's no Fred, so Fred can't wake up, but that's what Fred was waiting for, was that Fred Ness, what believed itself to be a Fred, was waiting to wake up, couldn't wait. And because I had cut a deal with God, although I hadn't noticed that she had not done a handshake on it. And so my deal that I had cut with God was that when I woke up, all of my problems would be solved, and everything would go okay in my life from then on out. And that probably, as I have said before, animals would be very nice to me. People would not only forgive me, but begin to treat me with deference and all this other bullshit. I mean, that's just the way. That's the way I really thought it was going to happen. I mean, it couldn't have been more egoic. And you want to know why my awakening was so pronounced? It's because I was so damn far away from it, right? It just, I by mistake got mad at God, and God read it as surrender, and awakening occurred here. But I was a long way from it, even though I had been a seeker for 24 years. So when awakening did occur, I noticed that these problems were not solved. And actually, nobody could tell that I had woken up. Betsy, maybe Betsy, but only because my behavior became a little less aberrant than it had been before, not because I straightened up and flew right. When I say wake up, what I mean, of course, is that unconscious awakeness moved from a state of unconscious awakeness, to the state of conscious awakeness. So in other words, awakeness really moved from a state of unconsciousness to consciousness. It now recognized and knew itself, and slowly began accepting itself. But its first arising was fine, but it was a day or two later that I began to notice that the problems hadn't gone away. And this was a big disappointment. It really was. I was very disappointed by Fred. I've had clients tell me, damn, And he said, I know this is incredible, but I'm disappointed, because the ego will always be disappointed in awakening, because it's not about the ego. It just isn't. It's about anything but the ego. Because it's the awakening itself is seeing through the fact that there is no ego there. There's not an ego over there that we're trying to get rid of, or in here that we're trying to get rid of, or out there that we're trying to get rid of. There's just no ego. When it makes itself known, it works very, very hard. But when you go after it, as Ramana used to say, it disappears, right? It vanishes. That's what's his word. It vanishes. So there's nothing in it for the ego, and the ego is therefore disappointed. Now the problem is that if it's not recognized that it's the ego that's disappointed, then you will think that this is the way it works. Fred had an awakening, and it was supposed to be really something. I had been sold the fact that this was graduation from spirituality. And now here in the hell, I find out it's not graduation from spirituality. It's actually the commencement of an entirely new spiritual life, called the authentic spiritual life. By which I mean, you can't really, if I love all of you, and I don't want any of you to be any different than the way you are. But if you believe you're an individual, nice as you might be, you're insane. And an insane person simply cannot have an authentic spirituality. They can have a devoted spirituality. They can have something that they're just deeply into it. Their whole life is about it, all this and that and the other. I'm not saying that they're not giving their all. I'm saying that their all hasn't yet given back. See, there's nobody's fault if you don't wake up. You're not supposed to wake up until you do, or unless you do, because some people are not supposed to wake up at all. How do we know? They don't. Is that the fact? The majority don't. They move from the cradle to the grave without ever having any suspicion of who and what they really are. But once you come to find out who and what you really are, you also come to discover that, well, this is nothing like what I had in mind. And and Fred's awakening, for Fred's purposes, is a disappointment for me, Fred. That's the way it works. See, but let's look at something. The first time that I woke up in 1992, it was just a very clear, clean glimpse. I mean, it was just as pure as anything you can imagine. Didn't last very long, but it was incredibly clear. And but just not long after that, it might have been seconds, it might have been minutes, I don't know. I'm sure it was not an hour before ego came in and said, wow, you've done it. You've had an awakening, Fred. Look how special you are now. Incredible. And so then Fred wanted to make sure that everybody knew that Fred was, had just had an awakening and stuff. And since you couldn't recognize it from seeing me, I shaved my head. In the deep hope that maybe then you would recognize. Of course, everybody just thought I was a skinhead. It kind of went backwards on me, but it didn't matter. At least I knew. And I now knew that I, Fred, was different because I, Fred, had an awakening. And then I suffered for the next 14 years trying to get back to that very special spot that I, Fred, believed I had been in. But the awakening is actually seeing through Fredness and recognizing it is Fredness. Like that there are patterns here, and there are, just a second, I got a little alarm going off here. I'm supposed to be sending out my satsang invitations, but they can wait just a few minutes. So when awakeness woke up to the absence of a Fred, Fred did not wake up to the presence of God. She was already here, and there was no Fred to wake up to that. God woke up to the fiction of Fred Davis instead. But this is a big disappointment for the ego, because let's look at the first thing the ego believes. The ego believes because it was Fred that wanted to wake up so badly, and it was Fred, therefore, that knew that it was Fred's precious awakening for Fred's precious purposes. That's the way it went. The only thing being there ain't no Fred. So since there is no Fred, it cannot possibly be Fred's awakening. Nor can the awakening be for or about a Fred. It can only be for itself. Awakeness wakes up, so to speak, through these units for its own purposes, right? And when I say its own purposes, that makes it sound like it's a living thing. You can't say it's dead, but it makes it sound like an entity, and I don't mean that at all. It's just pardon the limitations of language. You got to just go with me. I can't tell you the truth. I've got to lie to you. I'm trying to lie to you as skillfully as I can. So please cut me some slack. So when Fred Ness was seen through by awakeness, it was not so that Fred could run and go tell his friends how special he was now. Disappointing as that was. It wasn't. I don't actually know what it was for. Some people would point a finger at this teaching and say this is what it was for. But it's not what it was for. It wasn't for anything. It just happened. There's not an actual like designated purpose. This idea that we all sit on a cloud prior to birth and pick our parents and pick our destiny and all this is total bullshit. And I'm sorry for all you New Agers out there, but it's total bullshit. It just is. And a good deal of what you believe to know is total bullshit. That's the reason for this teaching, is that this teaching is an unteaching. I don't teach you new things. I unteach what you think you already know, and therefore you can come to see the truth on your own. You don't have to believe anything I tell you about the truth. I can show it to you over and over again. That's the truth. I do it. I do it every week, every Sunday in satsang. I do it every week in clarity sessions and awakening sessions. The coming to see what you really are is not that difficult. Coming to accept what you really are, now that is one hell of a challenge. And whose challenge is it? Nobody's. Nobody's challenge. It's not Fred's challenge. There's no Fred. Awakening occurs or it doesn't because it can't not. If you don't wake up in your lifetime, don't worry, you weren't supposed to. If you do wake up in your lifetime, don't take any credit for it because there's no one there. And you'll see that once you wake up, but you won't see it until you wake up. So you can't take any credit for it, although initially you probably will. I did, right? And I had to share my precious awakening with everybody and show them, you know, how cool I was. That's really what I wanted to show, was how cool I was. And you know, or that which would make me a good lover or a good bet to loan money to. That, you know, didn't happen. So another dream of awakening shot to hell. So the post-awakening blues is not, awakeness has no post-awakening blues. If you've got the post-awakening blues, what I want to tell you that means is that you ain't awake right now. That's what it means. If you're disappointed, is this all there is? Is this it? God, what's the purpose of all this? What's the meaning of all this? That's all ego. Awakeness will never, ever say any of those things, so to speak. It just doesn't have those feelings. See, awakeness is okay. It's okay with what is. See, and that's what we're trying to help you, awakeness, do through that unit, is to also become okay with what is. With certain exceptions, this thing is happy with what is. Then something will get out of line and it won't be happy, and it'll suffer and it'll notice it and it'll go, oh, you're dreaming. And that'll be that. I don't have to actually unwind a lot of stuff anymore. I'm not saying I wouldn't have to. It could happen, but it just doesn't happen on a daily basis because I just don't dream like that on a daily basis. Because the more time you spend outside of the dream, the less seductive and charming the dream gets. You really become not all that keen on returning. So if you're unhappy, if you're burned out, if you're bummed out, if you're whatever in your awakening, what that's telling you is that you're identifying with the character, and that the character is disappointed in the character's awakening, which never happened. See, the character never wakes up. It's awakeness that wakes up. Fred never woke up. Betsy never woke up. I'll tell you a quick story about Betsy. It was great. She was at the VA the other day, and she left her office and was walking down the hall to come home. She looked in another supervisor's office, and there was a new picture on the wall. And since it was a new picture, and it was a friend of hers' office, she walked in and she looked at the picture. And her friend was there, and we'll say her name was Julie. And she went, "Oh, Julie." She said, that's a really nice picture of you, and that's an attractive woman in the photo with you. Is that your mother? And she looked at Betsy a little oddly and said, "No, Betsy, that's not my mother." And Betsy thought, "Oh, now I've stepped in it. I mean, and said, oh, of course, it's your sister." And she said, "No, Betsy, it's not my sister." And Betsy said, "Well, who is it?" And the woman said, "Betsy, it's you." At least for that moment, there was so little identification that she didn't even recognize the photograph of her unit. Now, she did have an excuse, which is she said, "I had my sunglasses on." She said, "But I did know I had a dress like that," right? So identification is there until it's not, and it's still there even then. There's going to be some identification there always. It's not like Betsy runs around, like I need to put on makeup, but I can't find my face. That's not the way it works. And accept wherever you are. So you cannot resist your current state of awakeness and go any further. That resistance is the death of apparent spiritual progress. Accept where you are. Your awakeness, whether you recognize it or not, this is actually less waking up for awakeness in some ways is less of a big deal than you might think, right? Because there's no point. It's not like something really changes. Although for the unit, everything will change. I mean, only thing that changes is everything. I get emails every week from people. My God, I had no idea. And I will also get those grumbly little emails, and that means that they need a clarity session, probably, right? If assuming they had an awakening session with me, then if they're back to in that terrain, I mean, they might come out on their own. I don't know, and I don't care. But if they but they wouldn't hurt them. I can tell you that. So, because typically in a clarity session, if I'm with someone who has had an awakening before with me, I can usually bring them back very quickly because the teaching is irresistible once you've seen it. If you've had an awakening experience and it was not with me, I'd be willing to try, but you really need an awakening session, because if you don't, I'll get you back to brightness and you're going to fall back almost surely. At any rate, I'm not here to promote sessions. I'm here to say hello. It's Sunday here. I've got Satsang in just a very few minutes. So I'm out of here. I love you all, and have a fine Sunday. Bye-bye.